Vladimir Putin can't seem to help himself. In what seems to be an increasingly regular occurrence in recent days, Putin has once again ordered Russian aerial assets to fly into NATO airspace. Only this time, it wasn't drones, as we saw in Poland and Romania. Putin sent fighter jets, and that means Russia is picking a fight. The response from several NATO allies is deafening. This is Putin's final warning. The next Russian jet over NATO gets taken out because Putin has gone too far. But let's backtrack for a moment. On September 19th, The Guardian was among many media outlets that reported on Russia sending a trio of its MiG-31 fighter jets over the Baltic Sea. However, this wasn't any old Russian flight. The jets didn't skirt the limits of NATO airspace before heading back home. They crossed over. All three of the MiG-31s entered Estonia's airspace over the Gulf of Finland, prompting NATO forces to intercept the jets and guide them back away from the territory the pilots knew they shouldn't be entering without permission. NATO's response was quick. The jets were scrambled and had intercepted Russia's MiG-31s within 12 minutes of the MiGs being detected. But the damage had been done, at least in Putin's mind. He'd forced a NATO interception and had delivered a message that Russia keeps on sending: we can enter NATO airspace anytime we want. The initial response to Russia's actions was scathing, though NATO obviously stopped short of shooting the Russian jets down. Estonia's former Prime Minister and now the European Union's top diplomat Kaja Kallas called the move an extremely dangerous provocation on Russia's part. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was also quick to admonish Russia for its actions, noting that the jets further escalate tensions in the region. Von der Leyen also made it clear that the European Union, or EU, would respond to every provocation with determination, while adding that more pressure on Russia is coming. Putin may be sending fighter jets. However, the EU is expected to respond with its 19th package of sanctions, which will likely put significant pressure on Russia's wartime economy. That's all well and good. However, condemnation and yet another sanctions package are what Putin expected. Neither will be good enough to stop him from pushing boundaries and testing limits. But what might be enough is something that Putin doesn't expect NATO to do as the Ukraine war rages: the destruction of a Russian fighter jet as it flies into NATO airspace. Estonia has dropped more than a few hints that the next time Russia pulls something like this, NATO's jets will show no mercy. At first, the country's responses were fairly subdued. Estonia's Foreign Minister Margus Šakna took to X to provide the diplomatic response. By openly violating Estonian airspace, Russia undermines principles vital to the security of all UN member states, he said. When such actions are committed by a permanent member of the Security Council, they must be addressed by that very body. Some would argue that Šakna has a point. Russia is one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, yet it's also the member that presents the greatest threat to global security at this moment in time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has certainly destabilized all of Europe. It's also seen Russia join forces with North Korea, receive weapons from Iran, and develop its relationship with China, turning what was originally supposed to be a short and successful invasion into a truly global conflict. Šakna is asking the question that is on many people's minds: how can Russia stay on the UN Security Council while also going against everything that the Council is supposed to stand for? While Šakna's response to the Russian incursion was measured, Estonia's Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur delivered a much more pointed warning. We saw on Friday that NATO is functioning very efficiently, even to the point that if it were truly forced to use the last resort, which is the use of force, there was a readiness for that as well, the Kyiv Independent reports Pevkur is saying. And that's our first hint that NATO might soon start to switch away from merely intercepting Russian jets and guiding them away. Pevkur knows what Putin is trying to pull. Russia's leader wants these types of aerial incursions to distract NATO away from the fighting in Ukraine, Estonia's defense minister says. However, his warning has purpose, as he wants Putin to know that if Russia's leader continues to push his luck, the next MiG-31 might end up being turned into a flaming wreck. Another hint that Estonia at least and NATO at most might be considering a more drastic response to the next Russian incursion comes from the country's Prime Minister Kristen Michal. Estonian World reports that Michal held an interview with Estonia's public broadcasting network to highlight how the country already has specific rules of engagement in place in case Putin makes his incursions. Those rules include procedures for Estonia's fighter pilots to follow when shooting down a Russian jet. So that there is no doubt, we do have the capability to do what is necessary in our airspace, together with our NATO allies, Michal said during the interview. Estonia's Prime Minister also noted that Russia's MiG-31 pilots had the opportunity to leave Estonian airspace before NATO's jets arrived to escort them. That suggests that NATO identified and was able to get in touch with the pilot, only for those pilots to ignore the warnings and continue their mission. They had the chance to leave earlier, Michal said bluntly, in a statement that almost reads like a warning. NATO gave you a chance this time. Next time, you may not be so lucky. However, perhaps the most pointed warning that Russia's jets are going to be shot down the next time they violate NATO airspace came from Marko Mikkelsen. The chairman of the Estonian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee simply had this to say in the hours following Russia's incursion. 17 seconds versus 12 minutes. Next time we're doing that, if you know what I mean. What does Mikkelsen mean? We'll reveal the answer to that later in the video. For now at least, Estonia is going through all of the supposedly proper channels in the wake of Russia's latest brazen attempt to intimidate a NATO nation. Rather than rushing straight into action, Estonia has invoked NATO's Article 4 in the wake of the Russian incursion. That's the second invocation in as many weeks, as Poland did the same after Russia sent drones into its airspace earlier in September. You can think of Article 4 as a step toward Article 5, with the latter of the two articles being the one that mandates a military response from NATO due to the actions of an aggressor. Article 4 doesn't go that far. Instead, the nation that invokes it essentially requests a consultation with other NATO members to discuss a plan of action and what the next move should be after another nation does something aggressive. Under Article 4, member countries can bring any issue of concern, especially related to security, to the North Atlantic Council, NATO's main political decision-making body. This is the right first move by Estonia. Invoking Article 5 would be a step too far, especially as Russia's jets didn't attack once they were confronted in NATO airspace. At the same time, not invoking Article 4 to at least start a conversation about what is happening would deliver the wrong message to Putin. Inaction would show Russia's leader that NATO, or at least the NATO nations he's targeting with his button-pushing tactics, is too afraid to do anything that could lead to Russia escalating. Of course, that would simply mean that Putin continues to escalate until something bad happens, which NATO doesn't want. September 23rd will also see what the Kyiv Post calls a separate high-stakes UN Security Council ministerial meeting on Ukraine. Presumably, that meeting is going to focus on issues pertaining solely to the Ukraine war. Now, with Russia continuing to send its aerial assets into NATO airspace, the question will be asked of one of the UN Security Council's 5 permanent members. What are you doing? We'll have to wait until September 23rd to hear Russia's official justification for sending jets into Estonia's airspace, assuming it even attends the meeting at all. But the odds are high that Russia's response will be the same as it always is during these types of incidents. Deny, deny, and deny again. After all, that's exactly what it's done after its 3 MiG-31s were escorted out of NATO airspace. Euromaidan press reports that the Russian Ministry of Defense is already denying that any border violations occurred on September 19th. Whether this means Russia is trying to claim that its MiGs never entered Estonian airspace, or that Russia is so arrogant as to have decided that airspace belongs to Russia anyway, isn't clear. Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has also hilariously taken to X to provide the flimsiest of justifications for 3 of its MiG-31s having been deployed anywhere near Estonia in the first place. On 19th September, 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets had made a scheduled flight from Karelia to an airfield in the Kaliningrad region, the ministry claimed. The aircraft did not deviate from the agreed route and did not violate Estonian airspace. Estonia would beg to differ. So would the fighter jet pilots that NATO deployed to send Russia's pilots on their way. Anybody who knows how Russia tends to react when it's caught in the act, purposefully or otherwise, has seen this type of response before. Estonia isn't going to fall for it, which is why the country is calling for the next Russian fighter that enters NATO airspace to be shot down. And Estonia has company. The country most affected by what happened on September 19th isn't the only NATO member that believes it's time to break out the big guns when it comes to Putin's boundary testing. The Czech Republic says that Russia needs to learn the consequences too. Specifically, the Czech Republic's president, Petr Pavel, believes that it's time for the West to start responding adequately to what Russia is doing, up to and including a possible downing of Russian aircraft, Euromaidan press reports. Pavel added, violating airspace is a reason to activate defense mechanisms and thus shoot down such an aircraft. He also said that Russia will behave as far as we allow it, which is a clear acknowledgement of the fact that Putin will keep pushing back until NATO shows him that his luck has run out. If there's any doubt about that fact, Pavel also revealed that he has asked Russian ministers about these types of provocations in the past. I always used to ask them why they do it, knowing it could provoke conflict, Pavel claimed. What was Russia's response? Every time they answered, because we can. If that doesn't reveal Russia's mindset, nothing will. And to Pavel, this sort of attitude means that he agrees with Estonia that it's time to take more aggressive action when it comes to Russia's aerial incursions. Appeasement doesn't work anymore. What happened in recent days in Poland, Estonia, and what's been happening for 4 years in Ukraine affects us all, Pavel said. If we do not maintain unity, that will eventually happen to us. Veiled though the message may be, the Czech president is sending a warning to his NATO colleagues that this isn't the end of Russia sending its aerial assets into NATO airspace. It's far more likely that it's only the beginning. After all, it's already happened 3 times in less than 2 weeks. As we mentioned earlier in the video, the MiG-31s entering Estonian airspace came on the back of Russia having violated Poland's airspace. Poland, which is another NATO member, reported on September 10th that Russia had sent 19 drones into its airspace. some of which had to be shot down. CNN says that intelligence officials are still divided about whether this was a deliberate Russian attack or not, which is precisely how Putin wants it to be. You can also find out more about what Russia did in Poland, as well as Poland's response, in our video covering the incident. Just days after that drone attack on Poland, Romania reported that Russia's drones had violated its airspace. This time it was a single drone tracked close to Romania's border with Ukraine, perhaps suggesting that it was an accidental incursion on Russia's part. But there is a chance that it was deliberate, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky certainly seems to think that was the case. The move was an obvious expansion of the war by Russia, the BBC reports Zelensky as stating in the aftermath of the Romania incident. And Russia is still at it, even after what happened in Estonia's airspace. On September 22nd, The Guardian reported that NATO had to scramble jets, this time over the Baltic Sea. The target was a Russian Il-20M reconnaissance plane that, like the MiG-31s before it, ignored all efforts to make contact before it had to be escorted away. It's unclear whether the spy plane violated NATO airspace or was flying in international airspace without letting anybody know. But either way, this was another plane getting too close for comfort for Estonia, along with its Baltic neighbors of Latvia and Lithuania. This is happening too often and in too short a time frame to be a coincidence. Russian aerial assets entering airspace where they don't belong has become a pattern, one that Putin is using to test NATO's responses to see how far he can push before the calls from Estonia and the Czech Republic become a reality. It's starting to seem like Russia's leader is going to keep ordering these violations until one of Russia's aircraft is shot down. And if that happens, there's an obvious question to ask. What happens next? Oddly, we may already have an answer. You may remember earlier in the video that we told you that we'd reveal what the chairman of the Estonian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, Marko Mihkelson, meant when he said that next time it would be 17 seconds instead of 12 minutes. Mihkelson was referring to an incident that took place toward the end of November 2015, when a Russian fighter jet decided to violate Turkey's airspace. Turkey, which is yet another NATO ally, didn't hang around. Rather than scrambling NATO planes to guide Russia's fighter jet, which was revealed to be an Su-24, out of its airspace, Turkey went ahead and shot it down just 17 seconds after the Su-24 was detected. The incident happened along the border Turkey shares with Syria, the latter of which had a long-standing military relationship with Russia. Turkey saw an Su-24, unleashed an F-16, and that was all she wrote for the Russian jet. The BBC reports that the Russian fighter jet crashed into the Jabal Turkmen region of Syria, killing 2 people in the process. Russia later claimed that Turkey had used an air-to-air missile during the incident. A pilot and a marine who was sent on a rescue mission to the downed plane were also killed, the BBC says. Putin was quick to react with words to the entire affair. On November 24, 2015, The Guardian reported that Russia's president claimed that Turkey was the accomplices of terrorists, and he warned that the country would suffer serious consequences for what it did. The mention of terrorists suggests that Russia's Su-24 was so dangerously close to Turkey's border with Syria, as part of a Russian or perhaps Syrian mission to deal with rebels in the country. That didn't matter to Turkey. It saw a Russian jet and it took immediate action, taking it out in just 17 seconds. As a postscript to this incident, the serious consequences that Putin promised never really came. Russia deployed some S-400s to Syria and cut off all military contact with Turkey. It also sent a cruiser to be stationed off the Syrian coast. But in terms of a direct response to what Turkey did, Russia didn't do much of anything. In June 2016, the Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov claimed that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had said sorry for the destruction of the Russian fighter jet, and had also asked to be forgiven, while expressing his sympathy and deep condolences to the family members of the killed pilots. Erdogan's spokesperson confirmed that the apology was legitimate. Still, this is far from the serious consequences that Putin promised. Bear in mind that the apology also came over half a year after the incident took place. Cynics among you might suggest that Russia negotiated a somewhat public apology to save face over the fact that it didn't or couldn't respond to one of its fighter jets being shot down by Turkey with a similar act of aggression. What this incident gives us is both context for Mickelson's 17 seconds remark and precedent for a NATO member shooting a Russian fighter jet out of the skies when it violates NATO airspace. The question now is whether the same scenario would play out again if Estonia and the Czech Republic's calls for NATO to start taking out airspace-violating jets in 2025. It's difficult to say. For one, it seems that the Su-24 Turkey shot down, though a Russian jet, was taking part in the Syrian conflict. While still requiring direct Russian involvement, that conflict is a very different beast from the Ukraine war. Russia wanted to keep Syria as a puppet state, but it wasn't trying to take the nation. With Ukraine, Russia is in the midst of a full-blown invasion designed to strip Ukraine of its sovereignty. These are two very different situations. It's possible that Putin would feel compelled to respond to NATO taking out a Russian jet over, say, one of the Baltic states, with more than just verbal threats. However, Russia is weaker now than it was a decade ago, especially after more than 3.5 years of a grinding war against Ukraine. Putin may be pushing buttons and testing boundaries, but But does he want a full conflict with NATO right now before his forces have a chance to recover from a war that's still ongoing at great cost to Russia? There's also the possibility that whichever NATO member has its airspace violated to the point where it feels that shooting down a Russian jet is the appropriate response could also invoke NATO's Article 5. After all, the shoot-down would only happen because Russia is sending military assets into a NATO country's airspace. Does that constitute an act of aggression on a NATO country's territory? There are likely some in NATO who would say yes. Finally, there's the US for Putin to consider. On September 21st, the Kyiv Post reported that US President Donald Trump was asked if the US would come to the aid of Poland and the Baltic states if Russia continues to escalate. Trump's response was to the point and said precisely what America's NATO allies want to hear from the US president. Yeah, I would. Trump said, "We don't like it," when asked what he thought about Russia's jets entering Estonia's airspace unannounced, which is a gut punch for Putin. Russia's leader has spent much of 2025 trying to defrost his country's relationship with the US. Now it looks like Trump has cottoned on to Putin's manipulative tactics and has grown weary of Putin saying one thing and then doing another. With this simple statement, the US has affirmed that it will stand with its NATO allies if Russia keeps on pushing. And that means that Putin would have to face the one enemy he doesn't want Russia facing. But right now, Trump may have other things on his mind as Russia tests boundaries in Europe. The US and Venezuela are on the brink of war as tensions explode. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in Russia's recent aerial escalations against NATO.